So yeah, thank you for having me along. And I was just saying before the session started that I don't think I've spoken about my research since before COVID. It's been many years. So I don't know if you've ever seen that meme of the dog and he's wearing like a lab coat and like glasses and he's got like test tubes and stuff. And the quote is like, I have no idea what I'm doing. Or there's like a dog in a helicopter like trying to fly and it's like, I have no idea what I'm doing. That's what I feel a little bit like now. So for the last few years, I've been tinkering away on some work on identity content, mainly with work teams, but I feel like the work that I've been doing applies more broadly, and really trying to understand what it means to be us, and when you're in a group of people, what that group means to its members. There's 4 things that I'm going to cover in today's session, and I will start my timer so I can stay on time. The first is just to give you a little bit of background context around content, why it's kind of relevant, and yeah, trying to give you an understanding of what content actually looks like. And this is a surprisingly tricky question to answer. Why people should care about content. So looking at how we can kind of understand group identity through the content that people describe and define about their group. And then fourth and finally, looking at a way of helping teams gain clarity through identity content. So one of the things that I'm still working on, and I'll introduce to you quickly, is an inventory or a scale, I suppose, and an intervention that I've been working on with teams. So first, let's get some context about content, looking at identity, its content, and the meaning behind it. And hopefully you like all of my beautiful pictures that I put in my slides. So I'm gonna take it right back. I found some really interesting kind of philosophy content, and I'm a bit of a nerd, so I'm gonna take it right back to 300 BC. We've got Zeno of Citium, who actually founded Stoic philosophy. So if you've ever heard of Stoicism, this is the person that started it all. And one of the things that Zeno talked about is this idea of oikeiosis. And this is a Greek word, and it's apparently really difficult to translate, but here are a couple of kind of synonyms. It's this idea of affinity or alliance, appropriation or appropriating things, into being, making akin to, or coming to belong to. And so hopefully that gives you some sense of what this word is about, but there's a more kind of recent dissertation that talks about oikeiosis. And really the term arose from this Greek word of the household or the private realm. And it's this idea of what becomes your own, what is one's own. And in the philosophical texts, they often use this word as a metaphor for the process of integrating someone or something into your identity. And the author kind of generally translates oikeiosis as identification. So taking someone or something up into one's identity and making this part of your inner household. And just thought this was really nice, going back a few thousand years, that people kind of had this sense of like identification and, you know, the sense of like expanding the self to include other things and other people. And this is something that we study a lot in modern psychology, and it has a lot of kind of profound influence over my research and the work that I do, as well as many other people. I also got Melly Tantalos, who was one of our Org Psych Master students, to fact check me on this. So I said, like, have you ever heard of this word? And she said, oh, not really, but oikos means house. So it's a place that you belong. It makes sense that it could mean like a sense of home or belonging. And it could also mean that it's like familiar, the sense of familiarity. And so by extension, identifying with something. So I think I'm on the right track here. So thank you, Melly. But I thought, yeah, applying this sense of like, a house, you know, this sense of like, what is in your house? What kind of house do you belong to? And if I kind of apply this to, you know, CBOP, if we thought of ourselves as a little house that we all belong to, how do we go about understanding this? And I guess, you know, if you look at a standard approach, maybe in the social identity literature, you might measure someone's identification, oikeiosis, and how strongly they identify with the Center for Business and Organizational Psychology. And that would tell you certain things about, you know, them and this group. I mean, in particular, like this sense of connection, or how strongly you are connected to the group, it's a really kind of profound piece of information to know, because it tells us whether or not people are going to be trusting. It can inform us about their levels of well-being and motivation. It's a basis for leadership and productivity. People are more likely to collaborate and communicate, and, you know, can help people kind of mobilize and take collective action. So there's a lot of information contained in that, and it can kind of tell us a lot. But what it doesn't tell us about is kind of the nature of the group. And actually, if you look at the item content there, like that in-group thing, which you might put as the Center for Business and Organizational Psychology, or any group for that matter, it doesn't really tell you about the nature of the group that you're connected to. So we can understand certain things about our little CBOP house, but we actually can't really understand, like, who are the members? What does it feel like to be a member of this group? What are the activities that we engage in every month or every week? What are the normal kind of behaviors or the rules that we follow? Where are we located in physical space or geographical location? What are our goals and problems? And do we have a kind of story or a sense of history? And these are the sorts of things that don't get captured in a lot of the scale items that we use, identification and beyond. And kind of in the study of groups, we often strip out the meaning of the groups in order to kind of get some sense of, the magnitude or some kind of quantification of what's going on. And I find this kind of a little bit, like, it makes sense, but it's also a little bit problematic. And one of the reasons why is because out in the world, like, the content that we use to describe and define ourselves is the main thing that we default to. So if you go on the website for Center for Business and Organizational Psychology, you don't see scale data. You don't see anything quantified. It's all our story. It's all descriptive content about who we are. It even says about us, our programs, our people. These are all the things that I think, describe and define us. And so, yeah, in the real world, we kind of default to meaning and not magnitude. And generally, we think and speak and kind of operate in terms of the content that defines our groups. And so there's a bit of a contrast here. In the research, like, content, no one really focuses on it. And I did a search yesterday, just typed in social identity into Scopus, and there were 16,000 plus results. And then you also type in identity content, and I got like just under 200. And there's a big discrepancy here between the amount of research that's dedicated to studying identity, often through things like identification, and studying the content of that identity, what it means to its members. And so the main point here is that less than 1% of the research that we have focuses on the content, even though this is kind of how we actually normally operate in groups and in our day-to-day lives. And yeah, this is kind of a really simple point. It's the content that defines us. You can be a member of many different kinds of groups. You could be a national or ethnic or cultural group. You can be on a sporting team. You're all part of families and you're part of work groups. And even across those four groups, you can see there are distinct things about them that differentiate them from one another. And even within each of those, each family is different for lots of different reasons. And like, hypothetically, someone could identify just as strongly with each of these groups, but there would still be such an array of differences around them. And a key point that's made in the social identity literature is just really like, when one of these identities is active, it shapes your psychology. What you think, what you feel, the way you act, and kind of how you speak and interact with people is shaped by that group context. And in particular, the content of that context. So what does it mean to be on this team? Well, we wear blue jerseys and we kick around a soccer ball. But then when I go home, I'm thinking about, different priorities, cooking dinner and cleaning the house. So your goals shift, the language that you use shifts, and all of this stuff is kind of, that's the stuff that makes sense. And it's really guided by the content that defines us. And then similarly, even when we look at kind of the processes that we use, like leadership, for example, and the processes of identity management, this sense of we and us and a sense of shared social identity sits at the heart of these group processes. So if you want to do identity entrepreneurship or become prototypical of your group, you need to understand the nature of the group that you're trying to do those things with. But this is a little bit of a black box, as I said before, like, the content of these groups and the things that then inform how we go out and lead them remain a little bit of a mystery to us. So yeah, the kind of key headline point here is, when it comes to group identity, I think both connection, that sense of identification, and content co-determine your behavior. So you need a bit of both. And this is captured really well in a quote by Felicity Turner-Zwinkels. She says, without connection strength or identification strength, content has no impact on behavior. And without content, strength has no meaning. And so you really get the sense that these are kind of complementary forces, a yin and a yang. But actually, like, we don't know much about identity content. We know mostly about this sense of connection and identification, maybe these other things that we quantify, and not really much about, the meaning of the groups that we're a part of. And so we've got one, not the other. We've got yin and not yang, let's say. And so this really drove my primary kind of research question. I was just like, well, what is content? Like, what is this other side of the equation. And when you look out at the research, there's not many papers on this. So the question isn't very well answered. And yeah, there were two kind of aims in this first bit of research that I'm going to walk you through now. The first one was just like looking at the different ways that people define and describe their group. Are there kind of patterns or frequently occurring kind of themes in that? And then when we have all that information, can we organize it into some kind of structure or framework that is usable? So the first study I ran, it was probably like 3 or 4 years ago now, got a large sample of people in work teams. And you can see some of the kind of details there. And I wanted to make the sample reasonably diverse just to kind of capture the full breadth of different kind of teams and industries that people could be in. And I wanted a large size sample because often when you do qualitative work, you interview 12 people and you do really long interviews with them, and then you try to extract these principles. But if you're only talking to 12 people, is that really representative of some broader theme? So I have this really strange kind of approach where I've got a large sample and I've done qualitative analysis on it. And hopefully anyone that's done this will really feel for me right now, because there was a lot of content that came out. We used these two different kind of prompting processes. One was really kind of open and spontaneous. We kind of just said like, what is it about your group? Just tell us about it, define it, in general, just to see kind of spontaneously what would come up and can we capture the full breadth of what's kind of coming to people's minds. But then also I was like, I need to spend a few $1,000s on this survey. So I want to make sure that I actually get some good qualitative data from it. So I gave them a little bit more of a structured, closed response, where it's like, here are some of the things that could define a team. Can you rate them and figure out which ones are the most important and then write about those? So I just wanted to give people some kind of something to think about. A little bit like if I said, describe your personality, there'd be things that come to mind, but you'd probably miss out on a good chunk of it as well. And as you can see, there was an awful lot of content that came through this. I sifted through and did basically a thematic analysis of that content, and then came up with themes and asked independent raters to kind of look at my coding and go, yeah, it's good. And yeah, just to kind of walk you through a little bit more about that prompting, just in case you had any questions around it, the low or the open structured prompting, asking people to describe their group. What are the defining features of your team? How is it different? What makes it special? Does your group or your team have a story? If so, what would it be? And is there anything else? Are there any gaps, things you might have missed? And then the closed prompting was a bit more like, here are a bunch of features that could define your group: traditions, values, beliefs, apparel, environment. Select the 3 most important features you think define your team, and now briefly describe those. And then again, have we missed anything? And yeah, just to give you an example of some of the content that came out of this. So the low structured content, my team is multicultural and multidisciplined. We're all from different backgrounds. However, we are all at a similar stage in our careers and lives, and thus are able to empathize with each other. We have a good social environment that fosters good discussion on work and non-work subjects. The group is the way it is because of the prevailing culture of our organization and the active effort to recruit people who also share this culture. And then the high structured content, we are a highly diverse team, not just in appearance, but in ideas and personalities, which makes coming up with solutions to issues easier than depending on a narrow-minded approach. We typically use 10 codes and the phonetic alphabet due to the nature of our work. This makes for ease of communication over radios and other means of instantaneous communication. So all sorts of stuff came through. It was really wild, like the kind of variety of responses that came through in the content. But in these things, I was trying to look at what are the kind of things that people are actually talking about? Are there kind of discrete dimensions in this? And after a lot of work and a long time sifting through, we came up with 33 content dimensions. I guess there are many ways to kind of cut this pie, but this is the way that we ended up with. And what you can see here is a kind of list of the 33 dimensions ranked according to the number of codes we were able to find and apply. And so just a kind of key observation here is things like demographics. So male, female, age, profession, just these kind of factual observations were the most frequent thing people described about their group. And then the next most common thing was what do we normally do? We go to coffee every day, and this is how we do things here. And then another interesting one was what I've called performance, but it's just how well are we doing as a group? Are we actually successful? Are we doing what we are supposed to? Bonds is what it feels like to be in this group. Do I feel connected? Are we a family? Or is it hostile? This kind of sense of connection or disconnection with people. How we cooperate and collaborate with one another. What does it feel like to be in this group in terms of the emotions or the kind of the tone in it? What is our purpose? So yeah, you can see kind of that there were these discrete dimensions, but as you go further and further down, they were less frequent. And actually, one of the most interesting things I found was that values came up the least frequently, which is kind of ironic because it's often listed as a stereotypical content dimension. Like when you ask people what is identity content, that's often one of the first things they say. It's also kind of counterintuitive because we explicitly prompted for it. We said, like, as an example, shared values. And in the closed prompting, it was given as one of the things that could define a team. And it just didn't come up, which I think is really interesting because in organizational psychology, it's one of the things that we also harp on about a lot. Another kind of interesting thing is that people didn't really make that many comparative statements. So number 31, and that's something that we talk about in at least social identity approach, as in like people define themselves comparatively in relation to other groups. But in terms of the content, I didn't really see that come out anywhere near as much as something like diversity, which was number 24, which was actually this realization that the thing that defined our group was that we were all different and that we're all kind of diverse and multicultural. So that actually came up more frequently than we're different from that group or we're better than that group or, these are the things that separate us. So then that was kind of interesting. You've also got the percentage of the total codes and a Cohen's kappa, which is basically the inter-rater reliability there, just to kind of say that the coding generally was good. So I guess one thing you can take away from this is that identity content is complicated. There's a lot to it, like 33 dimensions. I probably could have cut some of those apart, like I've bundled some of those things together because I thought it made sense to, but there's more to it. And, again, Felicity Turner-Winkels, I've drawn a lot from her work on this because she's one of the few people that have studied identity content. And the way in which she kind of talks about it and defines it is that it's any string of semantic concepts. So the diversity of language is really like any of those things could be associated with your group identity. There's so much freedom and variety with which we can like construct who we are. And that kind of makes sense, right? If we go back to those groups, what it means to be in a particular culture or in a particular work group, they're so different. How do you actually describe those things? Well, yeah, it's going to be through content. So it necessarily has to be vast and complicated. And I remember Alex said in my confirmation, there's a reason people don't study this. And now I see what he means. It's been a labor of love trying to figure this stuff out. But yeah, as I said before, I think this is kind of what it needs to be. People and groups come in all forms, and we need to be able to capture the essence of what it means to be a human in a social group, and the many different things that this can mean. So taking those 33 dimensions, though, like that's kind of interesting in and of itself, but can we actually structure this? And I read through the social identity literature to try and get some guidance around this. And although they talk about content more explicitly than maybe other theories of identity, there's not as much guidance as I might have hoped for. But nonetheless, I was able to kind of extract 5 broad kind of types of content that I think are stated in the theory. The first one I've labeled sentiment, so how people think and feel in your group or toward your group. And this really comes from social identity theory itself, which says like an identity is like knowledge of your group membership as well as some sort of evaluation and sense of like importance. So there's kind of this affective and evaluative kind of components to it. A sense of the attributes that define your group. So who are the people in a group and what are the properties that we possess? This really comes from this idea of like comparative fit, that we can understand the properties that define a group in relation to another group, for example. But there are, particular features, maybe it's height or, brown shoes, whatever these things are. Could also be psychological attributes. Normative fit talks about kind of, being able to explain social behavior in terms of what you observe or what you expect. So normal and expected patterns of behavior can define your group. The fifth is that things like perceiver readiness talk about like you're more likely to join a group or even like perceive a group if you see it serving a function. So if it's going to help you achieve a goal or satisfy a need or solve a problem, then it kind of makes sense to kind of see the world in that way. So yeah, like we think about groups in terms of the function that they serve. Where are we heading? What are we trying to do? How are we getting there? And how are we going towards that? And then one thing that's kind of implied in all of this is that these things take place within a broader context. So we are groups nested within some sort of broader situation. So what is the bigger picture within this group sits? And the self-categorization literature often talks about like social context as the broader context. But I think this also applies to physical environment, as you know, Michelle's research kind of talks about. It also talks about kind of, I've seen research on people looking about identity across time. So time is another source of context. We have a history and we have a future. We're kind of nested in this broader temporal structure. So yeah, can we use these theoretical domains to organize our empirical dimensions? This is kind of the next key question. So did another study, but this one was much smaller. We only have 80 team members, and it was a card sort study. So basically taking those dimensions that we listed before and getting people to sort them according to those 5 different domains. So yeah, we had the 33 content dimensions, just a description of each one. So this was, shared activities that team members do together. We didn't put the label in, we just kind of gave a description of it. We added some attention check cards as well to make sure people were sorting properly. And then we gave them a definition of each of the domains, but here's just one of them. So the patterns domain, the particular ways that team members tend to act and interact with one another. For example, this could include typical patterns of behavior, what's considered normal or acceptable, can also include expected patterns of behavior, what members ought to or prefer to do. And then what I did is actually a multi-dimensional scaling analysis. And all this allows you to do is convey the relationships between your stimuli in like a visual space. And you can add as many dimensions as you like, but the research kind of says like, once you get beyond 3, it's kind of incomprehensible. So between 2 and 3 is usually the number of dimensions that you see. But more similar items tend to cluster closer together, and dissimilar items are further apart. And so kind of what you can see here is this kind of some deviation from the other 20 or so dimensions sitting over on the right-hand side. And this was the kind of dimensions that we categorized in the patterns domain. And we continued that process for all the domains. So looking at the dimensions that were kind of the furthest apart visually. And for the most part, these were pretty easy to categorize, but this is the final model. So you can see the 5 domains down the left-hand side. You can see the 33 dimensions down the right-hand side. And in the middle are just some facets that I use to kind of help organize this in a way that I think makes sense. So sentiment has feelings, ideals, and appraisals. The feelings and appraisals I definitely expected. The ideals I didn't, which was like people's, the motivation that they feel in the group and the things that they value. But this is what it was categorized according to the participants. The attributes had kind of objective information or observable information that you can describe about your group, as well as subjective descriptions, or these kind of perceived qualities that people have. The patterns dimension was like, how do we interact and work together as a group? And then what is like normal behavior? How do people tend to behave as group members? What's the function? So direction-wise, what are our purposes and goals? Where are we trying to get to? What are the ways in which we actually strive and pursue those goals? So what are our individual contributions as group members, the tasks and duties and roles and so forth? And yeah, how are we progressing and developing as a group? So this kind of sense of like progress. And then the context, this one was the trickiest one, and I think people had the most challenges, categorizing some of this stuff. Just because like context is always in relation, like, it's a little bit more ephemeral, but it's still kind of shone through. So yeah, people talked about kind of narratives, like their story across time. So past, present, future. They also talked about the challenges or adversity that the group faces. And sometimes groups are actually defined by their challenges. So like, what is a firefighter without fire? What is a police officer without crime? Like some of these things actually are, inherently defining of groups. And then, this broader kind of niche, the place in the world. So social landscape, who are the people that we work with and for? Social structure, where are we nested in some sort of broader social system? And physical environment, where do we kind of sit in physical space? So this is a lot of information, and I realize it's probably too much to take in one session. So if you want to talk to me about this afterwards, I'd be more than happy. But just to show that we've taken something that was previously very amorphous and nebulous and people had no idea what it was. And now we've got some kind of structure and clarity to it. And another quote from Alex Haslam: "The self is like a jellyfish." remember he said that in a talk, and it's like, it's really stuck with me. But now we've got a net around the jellyfish. It's holding it in. It's got some kind of shape. So although it can kind of take many forms, we have a little bit of guidance about what identity content looks like. And so, yeah, I think going back to that point that I raised before, if a sense of we and us sits at the heart of identity processes, and we have this content framework, it really gives us a bit of a map around, what we need to look for. If you're a leader, what are the things you need to pay attention to? What are the kinds of questions that you need to ask? What are the things that when you're listening to people talk or watching what they do that you can kind of go, yeah, like I think I'm seeing something here that relates to these different kind of aspects of this identity content framework. So yeah, I really see one of the practical implications of this as being for leadership, and that was really like a driving motivation behind why I got into this in the first place. Yeah, so this is, I think, really interesting. There's a lot more to it, but just, yeah, an example of an application of these ideas. If you want to do identity leadership, you can have your group identity content framework and your identity leadership processes, and I think those two things will work nicely together. So another question that kind of comes up as well is like, if people don't study identity content, maybe there's, as Alex said before, there's a good reason for it. Like, why should we care about this? Is there any information or value to be gained from actually looking at the content that people share about their group? So this is another kind of key research question that guided my work. And I think there is, like, I suspect this is just got to be the case, right? If this is how people describe and define their group, there's got to be some value to that information, but no one's really studied it. So these are very fresh, new, fundamental kind of questions. I was just really interested to know, yeah, what are the kinds of insights that we can gain through the content that people, use to describe and define their group? And can we compare this to standard approaches that we've used before? So third study, another reasonably large sample of team members working in organizations. And one of the things that we got them to do was complete this battery of psychometric scales. So how strongly they identify with their group, their prototypicality, how much they trust each other as a team, how satisfied they are with their team, how clear the norms are in their group, how interdependently they work, whether or not there's kind of organizational citizenship in the team. And then for some people, and I'll show you how we split the conditions in a second, we asked them to also kind of describe their group. So, those writing conditions that we used before are the same ones that we've used in these subsequent studies, getting people to describe and define their work team as well as these scales, just to see what information we're kind of adding to the mix when we get them to do this. So yeah, just to kind of show you how we split people down, we got them to do these kind of, basic kind of demographic and control items. And then we split them into 3 conditions. The first one, people did the scales and generated that low structure, open prompting content. Second condition was the scales and then the high structure content. And then a third condition was just kind of scales only. So they just completed that psychometric battery. And then we kind of asked people, a couple of questions, and I'll show you the dependent measures in a second, but I'm just kind of laying out the way in which they went through the survey because it is a little bit complicated. And because the scales only took a couple of minutes to do, like scales are really quick, we thought, okay, let's use these people for some other information. We actually presented them with content that we got from a pilot study. So we gave them low structure content, high structure content, and just scale data. So they kind of, in section 2, they generated these responses, and then in section 3, they kind of received the responses, and then asked them a couple of things. So this is just an example of kind of the content that people got. So that's kind of how we represented the psychometric information. So how much does this person identify with their team? How do members of this team work together? And then it's kind of got the scores. And then the content conditions had this kind of qualitative content that we talked about before added to that. So I just wanted to know, like, if we're adding content into the mix, does this have any value? And there were 4 types of insight that we were kind of looking into here. The first was, can participants actually better express or convey information about their group identity using content? The second one was, do people actually learn more about their group by actually reflecting on the content and expressing it? If you then get people to say, like, okay, you've given us all of this information, if you were to convey it to someone else and how much would they learn about your group? So how useful do you think this is for someone else to learn about your identity? And then when you actually receive that information, how much did you learn about this other team's identity? So that's the kind of expected and received. And yeah, the hypotheses were just that like content is going to boost all of these things. All right, so in terms of the results, for hypothesis 1, you can see when we add content and you compare it to scales only, you do see a significant difference, albeit a small one. Similar sort of thing for the reflective insight or the learning. So people are kind of gaining some sort of insight by adding content. In terms of then when you ask people to communicate or convey this to other people and you go, how much do you expect another person to learn? You see a larger effect here. And then larger still when you actually present people with content in addition, they do gain more insight. They learn more into the group identity. So kind of significant results and support of all those hypotheses. So yeah, the kind of brief summary here is that identity content appears to be adding some value to how well team members can describe their identity, learn about their own identity, convey information about their identity to others. And then when other people receive that, they actually learn about someone else's identity. But these only show an incremental effect. And I guess it was a bit of an exploratory study at the beginning to just see like, is there anything worth looking into here? What happens when we look at a more independent effect by comparing these things more directly? So study 4 is kind of the same thing, and we made a couple of changes. One is just I added a few more reflective insight items. So it only had 1 before, and I just wanted to make it even with all the others, so it has 4 total. Same substantive kind of hypotheses on those different types of insight, but this time we just compared content only versus scales only. So when participants generated content, they didn't complete the psych battery, and also then when they received the information, it was either content or those psych battery vignettes separately. So yeah, then when we kind of like reran the analyses, when you have content only and you compare it to scales only, you don't see a difference. So people feel as though they're able to describe or express their identity equally as well in terms of content or quantitative scales. When you ask them whether or not they kind of learned anything or gained any insight, there's no difference, but also actually you can see that like people don't really learn much from this process, which is kind of interesting. The expected insight when you ask people, yeah, how much do you expect someone else to learn if you give this information? So content only outperforms the scales only. So you expect that information to be better interpreted by other people. And then again, when you present people with identity content versus quantitative scale data, people interpret the content and understand it better. So I guess bringing all of this stuff together, we can see kind of there's some incremental value in adding identity content. And then in terms of the independent insight, this seems to have this social effect. So yeah, like people feel as though they can express and capture their identity equally well via qualitative content and quantitative scales. But then when you ask them to convey this information to other people, this kind of this social step, you see these kind of sender and receiver effects. So when people generate identity content, they expect it to be better understood by others. And then people presented with identity content appeared to understand it better. And I guess if I were to ask you guys a question, I don't really understand what might be driving this. I think it's really interesting that there are these differences. There's kind of this, like one idea I have is that there's some kind of empathy gap. So like the reality seems to be that content is better to convey information, but people don't think that when they generate information about their identity. So yeah, I'm trying to think about what the kind of mechanism or what the theory is that might be driving this effect. So if anyone's got any ideas, I'm all ears. But yeah, one kind of takeaway point here is if you want to give and gain insight into identity, I think you should use or at least add identity content. But yes, as I said before, almost no one studies identity in this way. And yeah, there might be a bunch of insights that we're missing out on by not asking people to tell us about their group. So in this last section, I'm just going to kind of tease you guys a little bit with some of the research that I'm working on towards the end of my PhD. It's not finished yet, so I'm kind of just highlighting what I'm working on and how it's progressing, and also just giving you a sense of how this work that I've done previously is now going to be a bit more practically applied. And yeah, the work that I've been doing is helping teams gain clarity around their identity through kind of, measurement and through intervention. And I just have this kind of broad theory in the back of my mind, this idea that, like, when you think about building a sense of identity, you don't just want to get people connected to, a group. You also want to get them to understand and have that clarity and insight into their group. And I think these are kind of two fundamental aspects of, building group identity, whether it be from a leadership perspective or from a team building perspective. So forging this strong sense of connection with your group so that people want to be effective team members, or they want to be good, members of their organization, and giving them a sense of clarity, helping them understand what it means to be a good group member so that they know how to do that. And I think these two things together are really what's going to drive a lot of the outcomes that we would expect to see. But again, this one on the right-hand side, this idea of, like, identity clarity and understanding your group, it's not really something that people have looked at all that much. And I'm interested to know, can we measure this? Like, can we measure the sense of level of clarity that people have into their identity? And then similarly, can we develop it through intervention? So this is really driving what I've been doing in the latter half of my PhD. We've got this kind of preliminary identity clarity scale. And as you can see, this is kind of structured by those content domains from the framework. And then the item content really came from the dimensions that people kind of came up with. And we've just tried to turn that into a set of items that broadly capture the different aspects of it's a bit of a tricky thing, right? Like, an identity can take all forms. How do you know whether or not people understand it? I would say that there are always going to be gaps in this sort of a process, but I'm just trying to get the ball started and see what we can come up with. But all of the questions are kind of structured in a similar way. That it's asking people, like, the stem of the item is kind of quite consistent. It's asking people how much insight or, how much clarity do you have into this thing? And then the part that changes is that kind of content dimension on the right-hand side. So the emotional tone in this team, the purpose of this team, the story of how we came to be, the context that we currently operate in. So it's kind of trying to tap into some of those different things that were in the identity content framework. And then this was really, like, the reason I did this was to actually measure the outcomes of an identity-based team building intervention that I've been running for almost a year now. And this is like a cluster randomized trial with two conditions. So one is we get work teams to go into this identity development condition. And then we have this kind of active comparison group, which is like a goal setting and planning intervention. And when you look at the research on team building, goal setting and planning has the strongest effect size. So we kind of wanted to see, like, how does the identity work kind of square when we compare it against this? We get teams, including managers, to attend a single 3-hour online workshop. And as I said before, we're kind of measuring identity clarity as well as a few other things as well. So again, that sense of connection through identification, as well as some of the other kind of common outcomes that you see in the team building literature. So a lot of attitudinal variables, trust, satisfaction, psych safety, inclusivity, collective efficacy. And at the moment, it's been really successful. So we've had a whole bunch of teams sign up and complete the workshops with us. And 22 teams so far have, like, nominated and signed up. And I've been delivering those fiendishly over the last 10 months. And we have 6 more expressing interest. So the sample, I think, is going to be pretty sizable. And as you can see, there's quite a variety of different organizations that have jumped on board to do this. I actually feel like the decision that we made because of COVID to run these online actually worked in our favor, because it was so much easier to organize an online Zoom session than it was to get to a location, get everyone there at the same time, run the workshop. So it's actually helped kind of people sign up and get through these things. So I actually feel like the size of the sample that we've got has really benefited from that. So COVID hasn't been all that bad for me. And so I'll just kind of quickly run you through what we've been doing. It's actually really fascinating. I've been using this thing called Mural. Has anyone come across Mural before? Okay, it's basically an online shared workspace. So it's like a big whiteboard, and you can add any structure you like to that whiteboard and get people to then share content. They put little post-it notes and pictures, and they can basically contribute to that whiteboard in any way they see fit. We get individual team members to respond individually to a set of prompts, and we can turn something on called private mode. So it actually like blocks out what other people are doing and you just focus on your own thoughts. And then you end private mode and it kind of reveals what everyone else has been doing. And as a group, then you discuss and reflect on the kind of content across each of the sections. But essentially, this is just a structured conversation about us, about the group and the team. And this is just a little bit of an example of one of the kind of outputs of the session. And I do send these to the teams after, but you can see the big colored boxes are structured again by those theoretical content domains. So the attributes, sentiment, patterns, context, and function. And then in those, we've got some prompts based on the individual dimensions. And people, are putting these little post-it notes. They can change the color and the shape. They can add images if they want. But we just basically get them talking about who they are in their group, what they think about their group. And it's really fascinating seeing the patterns and the ideas that kind of emerge from this process. It's very generative. So that first box is basically asking the individual team members to talk about themselves. And then when you get everyone to talk about that, you go like, oh, what are the patterns that you're seeing? And actually like they're just funny things that kind of emerge out of that process. So like one group was like, oh, we're all the same age. Like we didn't even realize, but we're all 38 or something like that. And it was just like this realization that we share something in common. And so it's like, as you can imagine, like that's going to build a sense of shared identity, right? Like, oh, we're all the same age. Okay. Like I didn't know that before. So these insights are emerging even from something as innocent as just like, hey, tell us about yourself. But then we also ask people, what are these shared attributes? What are the shared values here? Are the qualities that you use to define us? In the sentiment section, what does it feel like to be in this team? What are the emotions? And people are like, oh, we're always laughing and it's so much fun. And other people are like, no, it's really serious. And like, this is how, this is how it is in this team. Evaluations, it's like, how do we think about our group and how do other people think about us? So kind of reputation in a way. That's always really interesting, talking about kind of those judgments that come through. So people might express pride or, a sense of kind of like in terms of their reputation, they feel like they're well recognized and that people kind of acknowledge them. Then in terms of the patterns, so like how do you actually approach your work as a team? So many groups are like, oh, we use Microsoft Teams and we use Zoom to communicate. And like 12 months ago, that wouldn't have been true. So there's kind of this really interesting just dynamic of how people are actually interacting with each other. Asking about the norms. So what are the kind of rules or typical behaviors or shared activities that people engage in? I also asked them about the context. And this one goes in lots of different directions, but this group kind of got into it. And actually this, I think, if I'm not mistaken, produced the most content and the most interesting discussion. So just certain things about, the shifting context and the shifting landscape that's really affected the team and who they are and what they do, because they used to be defined by their workspace and now they're not in it anymore. And so it's really kind of disrupted who they are. And, even some, like there are funny little things that pop up as well. Someone was like, I'm working on my laptop and I don't have two screens, so I'm finding it really hard to do my work. And the manager was like, oh, I had no idea, let's fix that. And so there's all these tiny little things that just come out of this discussion that, I think are really special. It's like something as simple as like, of course, let's get you a screen. Like, we had no idea, but these discussions just bring so much to the fore. As well as the fact that, across a team, you see so many different ideas and patterns emerge. And then I leave the function thing to the end because I feel like a lot of team stuff focuses on this and people can get hung up on it. So I want to have this discussion first and foremost and then talk about the function of the team. And generally people are pretty clear about what they do. They know what the purpose of the team is, but it is really affirming and reassuring to hear other people kind of talk about that and, maybe use a different word or a different term that maybe someone hasn't heard of or talked about before. And then right down the bottom, I don't know if you can see it properly on the screen, but there's a little section where I have keep, stop, start, change. And this is just a bit of a reflective prompt that I offer to the group. So it's like, now that we've had this discussion about what we've been doing, do we need to do anything about this? Is there anything we need to keep doing, stop doing, start doing, or change? And you can see there's little, like these kind of insights that people are extracting and going like, oh, now that we realize this, we should actually make a plan to spend more time together. And like, it's actually generated lots of kind of follow-up actions, which is really cool. So just talking about who we are is really prompting people and spurring them into action. And I guess from a leadership perspective, it's like that's really identity-driven stuff. Like this is coming from the group and guiding what I need to do. I'm going to get my team member a new screen. I'm going to, like fix the air conditioning because people are cold. Like it just, I don't know, there's so many little things that come out of it, and it's really fascinating to see. But across this process, yeah, you can hopefully see that people are really having a pretty elaborate discussion about the nature of the group. And you can imagine if we did this for like the center of org psych, like thinking about, who we are, what defines us, I think it would be really cool to do. So if anyone's ever interested, I could run us through this session. Yeah, that's pretty much the intervention and where I'm at now. I don't have any data because I've blinded myself to what's going on. But in terms of like qualitative feedback, people are really enjoying the process. And maybe one other point that I'll add is just the goal setting stuff, I think, is also building a sense of shared identity as well, but just in a much more focused way. So you're still talking about group relevant content, but it's very purposeful and very specific about like, what are we going to do and how are we going to do it? It's less about the feelings and the context and all that other stuff, but it's still getting people like, connected with one another and getting this shared sense of us, which is really cool. And that probably aligns a little bit more with like the 5R program. Like one of the areas where you talk about content in 5R is about goals and aspirations and values. So it's probably mapping onto that a little bit more. So in terms of what I expect to see, I'd see like within group change, so kind of pre-post change. And I'd like to see some more identity clarity in my team building intervention. Like that's the main one. I'd like to see some like between group change as well. So like a time by condition interaction. But yes, I'm all done. Thank you for listening. And yeah.